In the midst of European royalty, there is one disturbing story that stands out as a chilling testament to the dark side of power and privilege. The story begins in the late 18th century with the tragic yet fascinating history of the Habsburg royal family. Known for their power, wealth, and influence, they were also known for their deeply strange customs, including one that has haunted historians for centuries. This family, whose lineage was both revered and ridiculed across Europe, had a disturbing obsession with a strange and disturbing practice, eating their own hair. It may sound like something from a macabre tale of royalty gone mad, but the Habsburgs were very much real. Their influence spanned many generations, and their reputation grew as their lineage continued to produce rulers, queens, and kings, including Emperor Charles VI and his daughters, Maria Theresa and her offspring. However, what made the Habsburgs notorious was not just their rule over vast lands or the power they held in European politics, but the bizarre and grotesque practices they adhered to, including their inclination towards self-destruction in ways both physical and psychological. Maria Theresa, who ruled for decades and bore 16 children, is often considered one of the most formidable monarchs in history. She was a woman of immense strength, leading her country through wars and political upheavals. Despite her monumental achievements, Maria Theresa's family carried with them a grim secret. Her children, for all their royal upbringing and grandeur, suffered from a genetic condition that plagued the Habsburgs for generations. The condition caused them to exhibit strange, often horrific behaviors and habits that went unnoticed or were hidden from the public eye. One such habit was the consumption of their own hair. The practice began as a peculiar form of self-medication, a desperate attempt by the royal family to retain control over their bodies and minds. The hair, once plaited or braided, was consumed in small amounts, often mixed into their food or boiled into a tea. The reasoning behind this odd behavior was rooted in superstition and the belief that consuming one's own hair could bring strength, ward off illness, or even enhance one's physical appearance. It was a misguided yet somewhat desperate attempt to overcome their frailties, real or imagined. For some, it became an almost ritualistic part of their daily routine, a secret ritual performed behind the thick velvet curtains of their lavish palaces. The consumption of hair, however, was more than just a strange habit. It revealed the Habsburgs' fear of imperfection, a fear rooted deep within their royal bloodline. For generations, the family had intermarried with relatives, often cousins, to maintain the purity of their bloodline, leading to a cycle of genetic defects, physical abnormalities, and emotional instability. The royal family's obsession with the preservation of their genetic line, driven by a need to uphold their power and prestige, eventually led them down this strange and horrifying path. Eating their own hair became a coping mechanism, albeit an unsettling one, for a family that was deeply afraid of their own genetic curse. What's even more chilling about this practice is how deeply it permeated the family's daily lives. It wasn't just the monarchs who partook in this disturbing ritual, but their children, their servants, and even the court physicians who found themselves complicit in the practice. As the Habsburg dynasty's grip on Europe weakened, so did their grip on reality. The family's obsession with their own bodies, with their genetic purity, and with their legacy consumed them, leaving behind a legacy that was as strange as it was tragic. This strange practice didn't just end with Maria Theresa's reign. Her children, including her sons, who would later become emperors themselves, continued the tradition of hair consumption, despite the psychological toll it seemed to have on them. The royal family's hair-eating ritual was one of many strange and disturbing habits that would eventually define the later years of the Habsburg dynasty. Yet it remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the royal court, shielded from public knowledge for fear of scandalizing an already fragile dynasty. As time passed, the family's health continued to deteriorate, both physically and mentally. The odd habit of hair consumption became a symbol of the Habsburgs' decline. Their once mighty empire fell apart, and the royal family's strange and self-destructive behavior seemed to mirror their political collapse. The Habsburgs, once seen as the epitome of European royalty, were now remembered as a family cursed by their own genetic legacy. And at the heart of their destruction lay this grotesque practice, their attempts to hold on to power and dignity, even at the cost of their very humanity. Though the royal family's eccentricities were many, their strange habit of eating their own hair stands as a haunting reminder of their downfall. It is a grotesque symbol of a family that tried to preserve their legacy, only to find themselves consumed by it. This disturbing practice was kept hidden for centuries, only recently uncovered through the diligent work of historians and medical experts who studied the Habsburgs' legacy with both fascination and horror. What had once been a whispered secret of the royal court is now a chilling chapter in the macabre history of European royalty, a history marked not just by political power and grandeur, but by the twisted rituals and behaviors that defined it. As the years passed, and the Habsburg dynasty's power continued to wane, the once glorious royal family found themselves increasingly isolated within their own palaces, prisoners of their own secrets and their unraveling bloodline. The curse of inbreeding, which had been at the heart of their genetic instability, manifested in more ways than just the disturbing habit of hair consumption. It seeped into the very fabric of their daily lives, affecting not only their physical health, but their psychological well-being as well. The palace became a fortress of secrecy. Royal physicians, court servants and trusted confidants were all bound by an unspoken rule: never speak of the family's most grotesque habits. The hair-eating ritual had become a common part of the royal diet, shared in whispered tones among the children of Maria Theresa and her descendants, but it was not the only eccentric behavior that plagued the family. The Habsburgs had an increasing number of mental health issues, many of which went unnoticed or were simply explained away by the court as the results of the burdens of rule and the stress of maintaining an empire. Ferdinand II, the son of Maria Theresa and the next in line for the throne, inherited the genetic defects that had plagued his family for generations. He was the product of decades of intermarriage within the royal family, and his physical and psychological issues became apparent early on. Ferdinand, with his weak constitution and erratic behavior, would come to symbolize the decline of the Habsburgs. His health was fragile, and he seemed to be a mere shadow of the towering figure of his mother Maria Theresa. His reign was marked by confusion and indecisiveness, and his behavior was often erratic, making him seem ill-suited to rule. But it was not just his physical frailty that led to his downfall. His mental state became increasingly unstable, and his paranoia about his family's legacy began to consume him. His obsession with the preservation of the Habsburg bloodline, even after the empire's collapse, pushed him into ever stranger and more twisted rituals. The need to maintain control, to hold on to what remained of the family's once mighty status, was a driving force that led him down dark paths. The family's continuing consumption of their own hair was not the only odd ritual that took hold during this time. Ferdinand's strange obsession with bodily purity became a hallmark of his reign. He would often retreat into private rooms, where he would indulge in rituals of cleansing and purging, convinced that by expelling impurities from his body, he could reverse the damage done by generations of inbreeding. These cleansing rituals, which involved extreme measures of fasting, purging, and bizarre herbal concoctions, did little to remedy the family's growing sense of decay. The Habsburgs' palace was filled with secret rooms and hidden spaces, and it was here that many of the more unusual practices took place. The royal physicians, often more like hired magicians than medical professionals, would concoct elaborate potions designed to restore balance to the royal bloodline. These concoctions, made from a combination of herbs, roots, and animal parts, were believed to restore youth, fertility, and health to the royals. However, the more they drank these bizarre elixirs, the more their minds seemed to unravel. The royal family's obsession with their own survival was further reflected in their deep distrust of outsiders. As their kingdom crumbled and their political power diminished, they turned inward, focusing solely on their internal struggles and personal fears. There was no longer any concern for the welfare of their people. The palace became a place of isolation and paranoia, where every stranger was seen as a potential threat, and every visit from a foreign diplomat or physician was met with suspicion. Ferdinand's reign became increasingly erratic as he began to see betrayal around every corner. Even those closest to him were not spared from his growing distrust, and many members of the court found themselves exiled or imprisoned for imagined slights or perceived disloyalty. But it was not just Ferdinand who was caught in this web of insanity. His cousins, the siblings of his mother, Maria Theresa, were also drawn into the world of royal eccentricity. They too inherited the disturbing habits and traits that had plagued the family for generations. The consumption of hair continued, passed down through the generations like an inherited affliction, and it became almost a symbol of their shared desperation. As the family's decline continued, their strange rituals became more extreme. The obsession with bodily purity, the strange medical treatments and the self-destructive behaviors all intensified as their grip on reality loosened. Maria Christina, Ferdinand's niece, would later become the next in line for the throne, but by the time she ascended to power, the Habsburg dynasty had already been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The strange, almost pathological obsession with the royal bloodline had all but consumed them, leaving them with little but the ruins of their once great empire. The hair-eating ritual had become so ingrained in the family's customs that it was no longer seen as a shocking oddity, but as a deeply entrenched part of their identity. The royal family's downward spiral was now an open secret in Europe, and they were regarded with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Maria Christina's reign marked the final chapter in the tragic saga of the Habsburgs. The empire that had once been a dominant force in Europe was now fractured, with its former territories in chaos. Yet even as the royal family faced their impending extinction, the consumption of their own hair persisted, a grotesque symbol of their desperate attempts to cling to their legacy. It was a sad, twisted reflection of a dynasty that had once ruled the continent with an iron fist, but was now reduced to nothing more than a macabre family, struggling to maintain what little dignity remained. It was this obsession with self-preservation, this fear of imperfection and decline, that ultimately led to the downfall of the Habsburgs. Their strange rituals, their internal struggles and their inability to face the reality of their situation made them one of the most bizarre and tragic families in European history. Their consumption of hair, once a symbol of royal power and mysticism, had become a metaphor for their decay, a reminder that even the most powerful families can crumble from within, consumed by their own self-destructive habits. As the Habsburgs faded into history, their strange legacy lived on in the whispers of those who remembered them. The royal family's downfall serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of inbreeding, the destructive effects of isolation, and the lengths people will go to preserve their power and legacy, even at the cost of their own humanity. The legacy of the Habsburgs, once a powerful and unyielding force in European politics, was now marred by their tragic obsession with maintaining a bloodline that had become more curse than blessing. As their empire disintegrated and their once glorious palaces fell into disrepair, the family's strange customs and unhealthy preoccupations only grew more bizarre. Their final years in power became a desperate struggle for survival, not just on the battlefield or within the courts of Europe, but in their own minds. Ferdinand's death marked a pivotal moment in the family's saga. His reign had been plagued by his erratic behavior, his obsession with his own body, and his unhealthy dependence on the consumption of hair. As his power waned, so too did his mental and physical state. Yet even after his passing, the royal family's grotesque traditions continued. His heirs, including his cousins, the daughters of Maria Theresa, would carry on the habits that had come to define their family. The ritual of hair consumption was now ingrained in their daily lives, woven into the very fabric of their identity as monarchs. What had once begun as a strange practice to preserve health had evolved into a symbol of their deteriorating sanity, a reminder of a royal bloodline slowly decaying under the weight of its own self-inflicted harm. Maria Christina, the niece of Ferdinand, became the last monarch to bear the weight of the Habsburg name. Her ascension to the throne was symbolic of the empire's last gasp, an attempt to regain some semblance of order in a world that had already left them behind. The Habsburgs, once at the pinnacle of European power, were now reduced to a royal family clinging to an outdated and decaying dynasty. Despite the family's fall from power, their strange and disturbing customs persisted. Maria Christina was well aware of the family's peculiar habits, and she inherited not only the throne, but also the burden of a royal bloodline cursed by its own secrets. As the family's most recent monarch, she tried to distance herself from the macabre practices of her ancestors. Yet, despite her best efforts, she found herself bound by the same compulsions that had haunted the Habsburgs for generations. The consumption of hair, once an almost secretive ritual, became a public affair. The royal court, already in disarray, began to lose its last semblance of dignity as the bizarre behaviors of the Habsburgs became increasingly difficult to conceal. As the royal family's grip on power slipped away, Maria Christina's own health began to deteriorate. She suffered from the same ailments that had plagued her predecessors: anxiety, paranoia, and a deep sense of isolation. These were not just the products of a turbulent reign, but the physical and psychological toll of generations of inbreeding, a curse that had left the Habsburgs incapable of connecting with the outside world. Their court, once a hub of political intrigue and splendor, had become a cage, a place where the family could no longer hide their strange self-destructive behaviors. One of the more disturbing consequences of this royal decline was the increasing dependence on medical treatments that bordered on the absurd. Maria Christina, desperate to restore her family's strength, resorted to consulting alchemists, mystics, and quacks from across Europe. These so-called experts promised cures for the royal family's ailments, offering potions, concoctions, and remedies that ranged from the plausible to the downright ridiculous. But no matter how many treatments they tried, nothing could reverse the damage done to their bodies and minds. The Habsburgs' physical degeneration mirrored their political decline, and Maria Christina, despite her best efforts, was powerless to prevent it. At the same time, the royal family's obsession with maintaining their genetic purity intensified. They clung to the belief that only by preserving their bloodline could they restore their former glory. This obsession led to more intermarriages within the royal family, despite the obvious consequences. In their desperation to secure an heir, the Habsburgs married off their children to distant cousins, continuing the cycle of inbreeding that had doomed their ancestors. The results were predictable. The new generation of Habsburgs suffered from the same physical and mental afflictions that had plagued their forebears. By the time Maria Christina's reign came to an end, the Habsburg dynasty was a shadow of its former self. Their empire, once a vast and sprawling domain, had crumbled, and their royal family had become a symbol of decline and dysfunction. The family's strange habits, such as the eating of their own hair, had long since ceased to be mere eccentricities. They had become a reflection of the Habsburgs' desperate struggle to hold on to a past that no longer existed. As Maria Christina's health continued to worsen, the once proud Habsburgs seemed to dissolve into irrelevance. Their empire, once the heart of Europe, was now a distant memory, and the royal family was reduced to little more than a tragic reminder of what had been lost. The family's obsession with preserving their bloodline, their strange rituals, and their grotesque behaviors became symbols of their inability to adapt to the changing world around them. The hair-eating habit, once a bizarre but intimate family secret, had become an emblem of their downfall, a grotesque symbol of a family trapped by its own past, unable to escape the legacy of its own mistakes. In the end, the Habsburgs' obsession with preserving their bloodline, their power, and their dignity led them down a dark and self-destructive path. Their inability to adapt, their refusal to acknowledge the changing realities of the world, and their relentless pursuit of perfection in the face of their genetic curse destroyed them from within. Their legacy, once one of grandeur and influence, was now defined by the strange and unsettling rituals that had come to represent their decline. The Habsburgs, despite their best efforts to maintain their royal status, had become a family haunted by their own history, a history that could not be erased, no matter how hard they tried. The tragic story of the Habsburg dynasty serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers of inbreeding, the destructive effects of isolation, and the lengths to which a family will go to preserve its legacy. The strange practice of eating their own hair, once thought to be a bizarre quirk, now serves as a chilling symbol of the family's desperate, and ultimately doomed, attempts to hold on to power. The Habsburgs, once kings and queens of Europe, are now nothing more than a forgotten dynasty, their strange rituals and bizarre habits lost to history but never truly forgotten. By the time the final chapter of the Habsburg dynasty was written, the royal family had faded into irrelevance, their once proud lineage reduced to a tragic spectacle of decline. Maria Christina's reign, though short and fraught with struggles, marked the end of an era for the Habsburgs. The family, long consumed by their own need to preserve their bloodline, had failed to adapt to the ever-changing political and social landscape of Europe. What had once been a powerful family, revered across the continent, was now seen as a mere relic, a reminder of a bygone age of royal excess and dysfunction. Even after the end of the Habsburgs' reign, their legacy lived on in the whispers and rumors that surrounded their bizarre habits. Historians, intrigued by the family's strange practices, pieced together the tragic story of their decline, including the eerie habit of eating their own hair, a ritual that had started as a peculiar form of self-medication but had morphed into something much darker. This practice, once a well-kept secret, had become a symbol of the family's grotesque obsession with survival, and their desperate attempts to cling to their royal identity in the face of genetic decay and social collapse. In the years following their fall from power, the Habsburg story became an object of morbid fascination for the public. Their once mighty empire was now divided and fragmented, their lands and territories swallowed up by the rising tides of revolution and war. The royal family's strange customs, particularly the consumption of their own hair, became a symbol of their failure to adapt and survive in a rapidly changing world. The monarchy had crumbled, but the legacy of their self-destructive behaviors remained, casting a long shadow over the history of Europe. The tragic tale of the Habsburgs is a chilling reminder of the consequences of inbreeding, obsession, and isolation. It is a story of a family that, in their pursuit of preserving their royal legacy, allowed their own fears and insecurities to erode them from within. Their strange rituals, once seen as eccentricities, became their undoing. The consumption of their own hair, once a secret act of desperation, became the ultimate symbol of their decline. What had begun as a ritual to maintain control and purity had over time become an expression of the family's inability to cope with the overwhelming pressures of their own history. In the final years of the Habsburgs' reign, the once glorious palaces of Vienna and Madrid had become little more than decaying monuments to the past. The royal family, isolated from the world around them, continued their strange behaviors, refusing to acknowledge the full extent of their fall from grace. Despite their attempts to hold on to power, their dynasty was no longer relevant, and their empire had dissolved into a patchwork of newly formed nations. Their strange rituals, their obsessions with purity and survival, had become nothing more than a grotesque echo of a once mighty family, consumed by their own legacy. As the last of the Habsburgs faded into obscurity, their story became a cautionary tale for future generations. The family's bizarre practices, especially their disturbing consumption of hair, served as a stark reminder of the dangers of inbreeding, isolation, and the pursuit of power at any cost. The Habsburgs, once a symbol of strength and dominance, had become a macabre footnote in history, their once glorious legacy, tarnished by the very rituals that were meant to preserve it. The Habsburgs' decline was not just a result of external political pressures, but also a product of their own self-destructive tendencies. Their obsession with preserving their bloodline, their fear of imperfection, and their desperate need for control led them down a path of madness and decay. The consumption of their own hair was just one manifestation of this deep-seated fear and insecurity. It was a grotesque and tragic practice, a symbol of a family that could not escape its own history, no matter how much they tried to hold on to their former glory. In the end, the Habsburgs' story serves as a sobering reminder that power, no matter how great, can be undone by internal strife, obsession, and the inability to adapt. Their strange and macabre rituals, once hidden behind the walls of their palaces, became the ultimate symbol of their fall, a family that, despite their best efforts, was ultimately consumed by the very legacy they sought to preserve. The Habsburgs' story is not just one of royal decline, but of the destructive power of self-obsession and the tragic consequences of a family consumed by their own fears and insecurities. The Habsburgs may be gone, but their legacy, both their achievements and their grotesque habits, lives on in the annals of history. Their strange obsession with hair consumption, and their desperate attempts to maintain their royal bloodline, have left a lasting imprint on the collective memory of Europe. The Habsburgs may have vanished from the political stage, but their story will continue to be told for generations, a macabre reminder of a family that once ruled with such power, but ultimately fell victim to their own twisted legacy.